Ladies and gentlemen, good evening.
Hablo un poquito de español.
I speak a tiny bit of Spanish, but I apologize. I don't speak Spanish as rapidly and as fluently as I would like. So I'm afraid I'm going to address you in English. I do apologize.
But at least my wife and I have been in Madrid over the weekend. It was very nice to see that coming here from England, I brought the English weather with me. So that's not all done. Now, I'm going to talk this evening about money and inflation at the time of COVID. I wrote this book in the last 2 or 3 years, and it was published last October. And you'll recall COVID began in March 2020, April 2020, when the world was shutting down. And obviously, this was a setback for the world economy. Let me tell you that it was a catastrophe for the economics profession. The economics profession expected COVID to lead to several years of disinflation or deflation, possibly falling prices. And within 18 months, 2 years, this forecast, this view, was catastrophically and totally wrong because we had the highest inflation for 40 years. Now, I'm also going to tell you that this evening there are 2 people in this room who in late March and early April 2020 said that right then at the very start of the COVID period that there would be an inflation flare-up. And I am one of them. And the other is Juan Castaneda, who's just in the front row here in front of me. So we've been colleagues for some years, and I've been very lucky to have Juan as a colleague. And what I want to talk about this evening is mostly a criticism of fellow economists. So let me proceed. I'm going to start by talking about the forecasts made by very distinguished, very prominent people in the economics profession, what they said, not just in 2020, by the way, that often these forecasts of disinflation carried on into 2021. But let me just start with this. This is what I've just said. I was right, Juan was right, my profession was wrong. And what I wanted to do in this book was to explain why I was right. The book has got 2 bits. It's got the analytical framework, the theory, if you like, and then it's got examination of the evidence. I should just say here again, this is very important to what I'm trying to do, that my theory is a version of the quantity theory of money, and I am, if you like, a monetarist. In Britain, I'm known as, I suppose, the leading monetarist in Britain, and I've led the public debate in a way for 30, 40 years now. However, having said that, I don't agree entirely with Milton Friedman. I'll come on to that later on. And in many respects, the theory is very much my own. So it's a great honor and privilege to be able to speak to you this evening about my very distinctive ideas. Okay, so bad forecasts at the start of this process. And I just say not just figures in the economics profession, but also in financial markets. The markets believed that there was going to be a long period of low inflation or falling prices, and interest rates reflected that belief. So we had this period right in 2020 and 2021. I'm sorry to be a bit technical. When the forward yield curves were expecting 0 interest rates, more or less, out to 2024 and 2025. Well, you may laugh about that now, but that's what markets were expecting. And in the publications from such organizations as the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements, the OECD, they again expected this long period of low inflation. And we had, this is May 2020, just a few weeks into the medical emergency. This is from somebody called Richard Clarida, who was effectively vice chair of the Federal Reserve of the United States. He was really their chief economist, and he said, the COVID-19 contagion shock will be disinflationary, not just over the next few months, but over the next few years, presumably out to 2023, 24, perhaps even 25 and 26. We have a lady called Isabel Schnabel talking in June 2020. This is to a very distinguished conference organized in Frankfurt, and she said, negative inflation rates are possible, and the worries about inflation will persist and will do so for a very long time, perhaps even out, ladies and gentlemen, to 2025 and 2026. And I just told you that, in fact, inflation in 2022 was the highest for 40 years in many leading countries. And then this is somebody called Olivier Blanchard. I'm not going to go through it in great detail. My time is limited. But again, this is a very distinguished economist. He'd been chief economist at the International Monetary Fund for some years, widely revered in Harvard and Princeton and so on in the USA, a totally wrong judgment about what was to happen in the next few years. So, and may also, the audience is very mixed. I'm told it includes business people, bankers, lawyers. I'm also told there are people from universities here. In a way, this presentation is for other academic economists. What I do in this slide is to say that I'm not to be confused with some of the economists at Chicago. My position is different from theirs, and I don't agree with ideas like rational expectations, came from Robert Lucas. I don't agree with things like market monetarism from Scott Sumner. I have a rather distinctive approach, and in a sense, I'm expressing it's a different school of thought. It's really to be called broad money monetarism. I know these things are very, very technical. They are very, very important. You know, I mean, it really is true. It really is true that Juan and I, in spring and summer of 2020, were the only people on Earth, more or less, who could see straight away what was going on, and there was going to be inflation in the next year or two, and we were surrounded by a profession that, to be perfectly frank, hadn't got a clue. And that's why this is important. I'm sorry it's technical, but and if I'm making these very strong claims, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I know what I'm talking about. Okay, the equilibrium national income, the supply and demand curves, they intersect. That's the equilibrium price and quantity. Sometimes the markets don't work like that, and there's problems in the markets and prices and quantity have to change. That's disequilibrium. Equilibrium national income depends on only two things. This is a very strong claim. This is the guts of my theory. It depends on the quantity of money broadly defined, which really means all bank deposits. And then it depends, the second thing is how much our attitudes towards the holding of money that we, as people, as consumers, as investors have. It depends technically on what's known as the properties of the money demand function. Then in my theories, the way the banking system behaves is it's trying to make a profit, and it consists, well, the commercial bank's trying to make a profit. There's also a central bank, and the commercial banks grow their businesses in order to make a profit, and the central bank's job, all sorts of things to do, but its main job in many ways is to maintain a stable price level. So this is the guts of what I'm arguing. Economics is a difficult subject. There are different views about this topic. This is the heart of my analysis. I don't regard most of what I say as particularly revolutionary. In fact, practically all my ideas have been thought about before. I may have brought them together in a somewhat different way, but and I want just to now to clarify one or two important points. When we look at the data, we look at To understand a theory, the theory must comply with evidence, yeah? We must look at decades of evidence. And so what one does in this subject is to look at how the ratio of money to national income changes over decades. And what that work will show is that changes in the ratio of money to income, national income, are small compared to changes in the quantity of money itself and changes in the price level. There is a stability in the money demand function, which is the critical monetarist idea. And over and above that, any changes in velocity can be explained by analysis of people's behavior. It isn't just a will of the wisp, it isn't just magic and it doesn't go all over the place. And these propositions are confirmed time and time again in analyses of real-world data. These subjects are controversial. Some people deny this. I'm sorry, this is what I believe, and obviously what I'm trying to convey to you tonight. This is not to say that at all times actual national income is in equilibrium. Obviously, if we think about Germany in 1923, we think about Chile and Argentina many times in the last 50 years, or perhaps not the last 50 years, but say the 50 years before the last 20 years. We see disequilibrium, there's problems. Business people cannot interpret what's happening in the real world because the inflation rate is difficult to predict, because government policy is crazy. You know, all these things happen all around the world every now and again, so we have what I call monetary disequilibrium. Now, let me then come back to March, April 2020. From a different era, really, back in the 1970s, 1980s, the Americans publish data on their banking system every week. I may be the only person in the world now who still looks at that data every week. At any rate, it's published on Friday evenings, and in my home in Gloucestershire, England, I look at these numbers every week on Fridays, and they come out around about 9:30 Gloucestershire time. And anyway, in late March 2020, there was a dramatic change in the behavior of these figures. Instead of going up by kind of 0.1%, 0.2% every week or something like that, which obviously at an annual rate is very, very low, sometimes you had increases in 1 week in the quantity of money in the USA, but there's bank deposits of 2 or 3%. Now, ladies and gentlemen, 2 or 3% week after week, week after week for a year it's a Latin American increase in the quantity of money. It's like what you'd see in excuse me if I'm unkind to any Bolivians here, or Peruvians, or Chileans, that they have seen that in their lifetimes, and they've seen the results of that kind of increase in the quantity of money. But this wasn't Peru or Bolivia or Chile. This was the United States. So then these announcements came out from the Federal Reserve, from the American government. They implied that this kind of rate of monetary increase would go on for a few weeks, possibly for a few months. Therefore, and by the way, these central bankers talked together, and what happened in Europe wasn't quite so extreme, but we had similar, well, not quite so extreme, but we had increases in the quantity of money in Europe, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, that all at these very elevated rates. That was when I produced, with Juan, these forecasts that there'd be an inflation flare-up in the early 2020s, when my profession was forecasting years of disinflation. I've tried to explain in a very nutshell what the kind of thinking that led to that. I know it's difficult, I know it's technical. Anyway, that's what I did. One of the things, again, that I did with Juan in spring and summer of 2020 was to say that, look, the COVID emergency, medical emergency, was the worst medical shock that modern humanity had seen. Surely you should be depressed about house prices, about the stock market. Surely. No. Because there was these explosive growth of the quantity of money. So I said, it may seem very odd, but we're going to see buoyant house prices, buoyant stock market in 2020 and 2021. And again, this is a forecast that was right. You might wonder why I have to talk to this evening. Well, I am quite well off, and I do apply my ideas in my trading. But I really want to make the world a better place, frankly. But what we saw, Juan saw, and I saw, was that the kind of processes we expected through late 2020 and 2021 did indeed turn out. We had these very strong asset markets, very strange if you was one of these more okay. The ratio, because of these great surges in the quantity of money, the ratio of money to income fell heavily. Also, we say velocity increased very sharp. The ratio of money to GDP fell very sharply, and that reduced the velocity of money. So what I said then was that in the next 2 or 3 years, there'd be a sharp rise in the velocity of money, and this was a crucial part of the analysis. So now I just want to look at a particular case, and then we'll look at other countries too. This is the United States of America. You had in the year to June 2020 an increase of 25% in the quantity of money, the quantity of bank deposits. That 25%, by the way, was the highest since when? Since 1943. Not the highest since the great inflation of the 1970s, the highest since 1943. Now, sure enough, then the growth of money slowed down, but in the 2 years to March 2022, the American quantity of money rose by over 40%. And you can see there the collapse in the velocity of money as the ratio of money to GDP increased very sharply. You can see the stability of that number earlier in the 2010s. My claim, and if you couldn't see the last few years, my claim was that that collapse would be followed by a rise. If the quantity of money was still growing with rising velocity, that meant more inflation. I said there was going to be more inflation. I was right, as was Juan. Let us then look at, this is America. This is the Eurozone. This is the UK. We had these similar patterns in all these 3 areas, and also, by the way, in Canada, Australia, and so on. And the point was that we'd get this period of rising velocity, less the growth of money collapsed, that meant more inflation. Did velocity rise? In every single one of those 4 years from 2020, middle of 2020, velocity increased. In all these 3 areas, the main parts of the advanced countries, I put it to you that the ideas worked. How am I going for time, Juan?
10 more minutes.
All right, okay. Basically, the ideas were correct. My profession was completely wrong. You may then say, if you aren't an economist, well, what were they doing wrong? And in my last 10 minutes, I'm going to try and explain that to you. Can I first of all make clear that the kind of monetarism which I believe is not Chicago monetarism. I do not believe that the quantity of money is a simple mechanical multiple of the base. I do not look at the base very much when I'm making analyses of economies. I look at all bank deposits, okay, and I follow them closely in terms of what's going on in the banking system is very important to what's happening to deposits. So, and I never look at narrow money for reasons which are not too technical, but I won't go through them now. And in my book, in fact, I have a chapter about the differences between my approach and the approach of Chicago School and Milton Friedman. The quarrels with the profession are to a degree with Chicago, and I know I would guess that we have here in the room some commercial bankers, some people working in the banking industry. They knew very well that when they're judging what they do in their businesses, They're thinking about how much capital they have, how much risk capital they have relative to the risks they take on their book in various forms by making loans, by buying securities, and so on. And they know very well that the capital of the banking industry is critical to its expansion plans, which are the expansion plans of bank deposits, please. So banking system capital is very important to the economy. This doesn't appear at all in Chicago. It's not part of the Chicago approach to the subject at all. But my quarrel, although I do have quarrels with them, is not so much with them, because at least we can be in the same room and be civilized to each other. My real problem is with other people in the profession, and I will try to be, I won't be too rude this evening, and I hope to be polite, but you can probably get a sense of what I really think about these people from my tone of voice. There has been in the last 20 years much praise given to a book published a bit over 20 years ago on interest and prices by a chap called Michael Woodford. And ladies and gentlemen, the guts of the argument in this book, and I'm simplifying, is that you can analyze the economy by looking at only 3 equations. The critical equation in terms of determining employment and output is an equation with a central bank interest rate. So all that matters to understanding inflation, output, and so on is this one equation, so-called IS function, which that phrase comes from Keynes's general theory and the debates stirred up by that book. Now, and by implication, may I say, sorry, I seem to have gone on. By implication, you don't need to look at money at all. In other words, when I was looking every Friday evening at these figures for bank deposits being published by the Federal Reserve, I was just being a silly fool, because the bank deposits, money, these are not useful things for economists to follow. This is what Woodford believes. Woodford's work has led to what I call interest rate-only macroeconomics, where macroeconomists think that all they have to do to survey the economy, to forecast the economy, to make prescriptions about the economy, all they have to do is to look at bond yields and the central bank interest rate, and therefore all of this tracking of monetary data that I do and one was doing is completely beside the point. I would say that the fundamental reason why economists got this episode so badly wrong was that they followed this interest rate only macroeconomics, and they put too much emphasis, I'm sorry to be technical, on the IS function. I'm going to move on very quickly from all this, except that, okay, this goes back to Keynes's general theory. I'll try and be very quick. Keynes said that the rate of interest is the same thing as the bond yield, more or less. He said that bond yield movements, therefore, are critical to economic activity. I have a table in the first chapter of my book showing this may be difficult to read, I'm not sure. Look, ladies and gentlemen, think about how you behave, think about how your companies behave, think about how financial institutions behave. What is more important to your behavior? The change in bond prices or the change in prices of houses, of common stocks, of small businesses, of land, of commercial property? I put it to you that those things, what I call variable income assets, are far, far more important. And that column there shows you the multiple by which the changes in the value of all those variable income assets exceeded the change in the value of these debt securities of bonds. Look, if we analyze the economy, we must surely have a theory where we don't just only look at bond markets, but where we look at what determines house prices, share prices, and so on. And I put it to you, that is broad money, critical part of my ideas. I'm going to be wrapping up now, but in my view, what this episode has shown that the inflation therapy of the early 2020s is a clear demonstration of the continuing relevance and validity of Friedman's claim that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And it therefore justifies Juan and myself and only a handful of other economists, there aren't many others who do what we do, but that quantity theoretic analyses are crucial and should be carried out and should be really central part of what macroeconomics is about. I'm going to finish with two warnings. The first one is really to my profession. I've been taking this sort of line for decades. I have been noticed in the British public debate. I have had influence on the British public debate. And I think some of the improvements we had from the early 1990s through to the 2007 were partly the result of that work and other people who came along and agreed with what I was saying. I'm afraid we've been in retreat in the last 20 years, and we still are. And of course, Britain's economic performance has also deteriorated. But frankly, the profession's performance in this episode was appalling. There is something deeply, deeply wrong with my profession and my subject, and the leaders of macro opinion, Blanchard and Clarida and all these people I quoted at the start, just hadn't got a clue. They were completely and totally wrong. Can I also just say, which is slightly, if you like, a tone of grievance, but I do want to talk to them. Do they want to talk to me? No, they don't. They think I'm so unimportant, they don't have to talk to me. And can I then just finish by saying that central banks in this episode, how do they explain away the inflation? As I say, right at the very start, when I saw these announcements, I could see what was going on and I forecast the inflation. And forecast the inflation within a theoretical framework which I built up over decades. No, this wasn't their fault. It was caused by external cost shocks that nobody had foreseen back, say, in March, April 2020. Of course, the Ukraine war came along at a very convenient time, and it wasn't their fault. No, it wasn't their fault at all. They should not be surprised, these top central bankers, they should not be surprised if populist politicians all around the world, when they get to power, end the independence of these central banks. I am in favor of central bank independence. Having said that, the key to getting inflation down and keeping it down is to have the rate of growth of broad money low enough that it is not too much above the rate of increase of goods and services. That will keep the price level stable. And the key to macroeconomic stability as a whole, to have steady growth, with steady growth of output and employment, and therefore one hopes fairly full employment, is to have stable growth of the quantity of money as well. Can I also just finish very, very finally? Governments must balance their budgets. That's just a critical part of the whole analysis. But there we are. So Juan, I think I've just about, all right. Can I just thank you very, very much, Maria, for your having me this evening. There we are. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.